get started. So I'm Bill Boley. I think most of you guys probably know who I am. I'm Bill Boley. I'm on staff for LCMC, FCC. I'm a tech advisor for cost of finance. So I do trainings like this all the time. And this is my decision support training I put together. A good chunk of it is based on what they talk about at PFMC or DFMC for decision support training. So I figured this was a more compact way to deliver that similar information, also with a little bit more added benefits that aren't included in that class. So we'll get into it. The agenda, so first of all, the purpose, why are we here? Why do you guys need to learn about this? What's important about this? Integrated decision support model, which includes 5 factors of good decision making and 5 decision techniques. So this is the decision making model that the Air Force teaches at Acquisition Leadership Challenge program to program managers and stuff. So this is how they're supposed to go through the thought process of how to include people and who to include when you're making a decision and what kind of decision it is. So we'll learn a little bit about those things. And then we'll go into the DOD Decision Support Model, which is a 5-step process. This is the same. It's really just like a critical thinking process, even if you really boil it down. It's the same process that's used for data analysis type of research and other research in order to solve business problems. And then we'll talk about communicating results, because really at the end of the day, you can do all the analysis you want. If you can't communicate the results, then it's really not worth anything. And then we'll go into a practical application exercise that teaches how to use Solver in Excel, which is an add-on to Excel that most people don't know how to use, but it's a pretty powerful way to use Excel in order to solve these types of decision support things. So all decisions aren't equal. I think that's pretty obvious to most people, right? So there's factors that go into making a good decision. Obviously, there's different decision techniques. You can direct people to do things. You can have a team build on things. So we'll go through those different ways. Obviously, knowing these things will help you scope and prioritize how much analysis you put into your decision support analysis. And also helping to understand what the goal is will, again, help you scope that decision support analysis when you do have to do one. Ultimately, understanding a decision support analysis will change in content and complexity depending on every situation. So you probably do decision support more than you realize because you're just answering a simple question, and that's actually supporting the decision that person's making. It's just that's the technique that they're using. We'll go through those a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot of different integrated decision support models. This is just one. This is the one that they teach at certain trainings that you potentially went to or will go to in the future. They're mostly the same as far as the steps. As far as the steps in the processes, they're more or less the same. It's just different names, different terms. So here we have the 5 factors in good decision making. So these are the key pieces to any decision maker regarding how they want to make the decision. It really comes down to how much they want to include others in their decision making process, whether they want to make the decision by themselves, they want to include 1 or 2 people, a whole team of people, or not even make the decision themselves and include a whole team of people to make a group decision. So obviously, when it comes to problem clarity, you've got clear or unclear. You've got the level of information, and these are scales. So there's no, it's one or the other. There's a scale in all of them. Obviously, if you're on this one extreme where the problem is clear, you've got all the information. The level of commitment is mandatory for the people involved. You've got low goal agreement, and it's time critical. You're going to get somebody who's just going to direct the decision to you, right? And we're going to go through that a little bit more detail. The other extreme is going to be, okay, well, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what even the problem is, so you're going to need people to help you figure it out. So you've got to include other people. So, and this goes through the 5 factors a little bit. So again, problem clarity is the degree of understanding. Information is what you know about the situation or the problem. The level of commitment of the people that are needed to implement the decision. goal agreement is the goal, whether the key stakeholders are in agreement with what the objective is. And then time is the one factor here that's got two dimensions, where one is the urgency of making the decision. If it's like a life or death decision, obviously it's very urgent, you need to make it immediately. Whereas if you're talking about DOD finance, it's maybe not always an urgent thing, although some people like to think it is. And then of course you've got the amount of time it takes to actually implement the decision as well. So there's two parts of that. So this is where that inclusion scale kind of goes from left to right. You've got low inclusion down here on the left and high inclusion up there on the right. And then you've got the 5 decision techniques here regarding their level of inclusion of other people. So each factor influences this inclusion scale independently, but they also need to kind of collectively dictate which is the best decision technique. This doesn't mean that that decision technique is going to be used. It just means really it's the most appropriate for the situation. You will find that everybody's got their own tendencies for these decision techniques. You may have a type A personality who likes to just direct decisions all the time, and that's their tendency to lean towards directing decisions. Or you may have someone who's all kumbaya and wants to do everything in a teaming fashion and get a group consensus every time. So just because you lean on one or the other, it's important to know, not only for yourself, but for your leadership leans one way or the other. Understanding that will help you understand how to support your decision support analysis and maybe help guide where that decision is made or the technique that's being used. So the first decision technique here, directing. Again, this is where you're not providing any decision support analysis. The decision maker is making a decision and directing everybody to comply. It's really usually this is used with policy things or regulations that are, there's no gray space for you to wiggle. It's comply or don't comply. So it's directed that you comply. It's the fastest way to make a decision, obviously, because you don't have to talk to anybody or you just think about it by yourself and make the decision. The decision maker is going to do this. We do run into problems when decision makers use this, and it's not an appropriate method, right? So if a decision maker is using the directing approach too much, it ends up resulting in decreased morale in the group because everybody feels like they're being bossed around, and nobody likes that. Everybody wants to provide their input. So it's a balancing act when using that. The next decision type is fact-finding. So in this case, the decision maker is basically admitting that they don't know everything about the situation. They may understand the problem, but they don't have all the information. So this is where the most rudimentary decision support comes in, where they're going to be asking for information from you. They're going to be asking for budget information, for cost information, or for some kind of data so that they can make a better decision. They admit they don't have all the data and they need to get it from you. It's still very fast because they don't have to have a committee to discuss the decision. They're just going to get some information and assess the problem and make a decision. The next one's investigating. So with investigating, you now are starting to bring other people, key stakeholders, into the conversation, right? You're selecting key stakeholders and probably the highest priority stakeholders to bring them into the conversation regarding what's the problem, helping get information so that you understand the situation, the decision maker understands the situation better and can make a better decision with that additional input from other people. Obviously, this takes a little bit more time because you have to explain the problem to other people and get their input and collect some data potentially. So it's often used when we see leadership who doesn't know the problem completely. Obviously, there's technical details in every problem that we deal with here that everybody's not going to know. So hopefully, this is probably one of the more common used types. The next one here is collaborating. So now this is where we're bringing in not just the key stakeholders, but all the stakeholders. So everybody's got a seat at the table, and we want to get understanding of what everybody has to say about the situation, get that additional information, understand the problem in a more detail, solicit information and ideas, recommendations. At the end of the day, though, even when collaborating, all that input's received and maybe a collective opinions are put forward, but you're going to have a single decision maker that's making the decision. So they may be taking in that key stakeholder information, but they're going to still make the call themselves. This is, again, very common in our organization because we typically rely on a single person to make a decision. So that's their role, and that's their position. And the last one is teaming. This is, again, where all stakeholders are included, and we're seeking all their judgment, and we want everybody to understand and everybody provide input, the problem shared with everybody, and the final decision is not made by a single person in this case, though, but a consensus is sought with everybody who's a key stakeholder. So this is where we actually get a collective, okay, we all agree this is the way forward, and we're going to go forward that way as a team, as opposed to the decision maker making the final call. We don't see this that often, but in some cases we can see this even here. So we see industry, we hear stories about industry doing this a lot, where they want their whole team to be on board with whatever the decision is before they go forward. So in summary for the decision techniques, so it's obviously important to understand this stuff because if the decision's being made one way or the other, you'll kind of get those, you'll pick up those vibes or that understanding as you go through the support of the decision. If someone's asking you questions and they just want information, you know that's where they're leaning. But if it's something that maybe you should be digging deeper, you can ask questions and facilitate that exchange and maybe move the decision support technique to something a little different. So this is where, a lot of times, again, people's got that personal preference. So if you're dealing with a decision maker who tends to do more directing, then helping them move towards the more collaborative type of decision technique with asking those probing questions and trying to understand better yourself, maybe will help lead to better decisions being made. Also, it's really important to know when, okay, I'm just being asked to provide information. This is a decision they have to make. So I'm not going to push. I'm going to just provide that information. Again, understanding all these key players and who's involved in the analysis will help you understand, how to perform your analysis. Obviously, if you're in charge of doing the analysis and it's something that's really the decision maker has said the key stakeholders are really important, you want to make sure as you're doing your analysis that you're involving the key stakeholders, that you're reviewing what you've done, you're reviewing the data you've collected with them, you're having meetings with them in order to discuss these things so that you can take that into consideration when you make a recommendation. And additionally, the final product, again, depending on the type of decision that's being made and the type of problem that's trying to be solved, you may have various levels of what your final product is. If it's anything, again, harping on this stuff, but is there any questions on the decision techniques? It's all pretty straightforward. We're just putting terms to things that we kind of understood, I think, mostly. So a lot of head nods, okay? So now we're moving into the FM decision support model. So again, this is the process, the support model that's taught at PFMC and DFMC. These are the terms they use, but again, you'll see different terms, but very similar steps in other industries, and data science uses a similar process. They just use different terms. And obviously this is tailorable for the appropriate decision being made. So everything's tailorable, right? We hear that constantly, that tailor. So this is just kind of a guideline to help you understand this is how you should think through this decision support. It facilitates critical thinking about the decision support you're trying to provide in order for you to provide the best decision support you can. So the first step, identify the issue. So this is where we need to look at what's going on. We're gonna dig deeper into some top level data if we have organizational data, or we have top level data collected regarding the situation. If we have facts and opinions about the situation from stakeholders, if we understand what the requirements are or what the limitations are, we need to identify what that puzzle piece is, if you will, in order to come down to what is the problem. So this is where we don't always know what the problem is up front. We kind of have to figure out what the problem is. Sometimes we get questions that the question that we're asked isn't really the problem. The problem's a little bit deeper. And this is the digging deeper to identify the root issues and eventually boil it down to a problem statement. From there, we want to analyze the issue, right? So this is where we start collecting a little bit of data and doing some high-level data analysis. We ask kind of the 5 whys to dig even deeper to say, okay, well, we've identified the problem, but is there any further root causes, or is there any other ramifications that are driving this problem? It can be helpful to do flowcharts or other diagrams in order to help understand the problem and the influences that the problem has to other aspects of the workforce or other aspects of programs. Again, it's all very problem-specific stuff, so you want to actually understand the full breadth of the issue in order to really decide. Ultimately, in this step, you're going to decide how you're going to measure your success. So you want to know the problem in the first step, and now you're kind of looking at the bigger picture of, well, how do I know my recommendation's any good? Like, how do I evaluate my recommendation? How do we score my recommendation, or score any alternative that could potentially be out there? You see a lot of times we get asked to do courses of action for a decision, to say, okay, are we going to go with A, B, or C course of action? We want to kind of understand, how do we score those courses of action in order to make a recommendation. And it's all very important that we document as we go with this stuff, because again, when we get to the end and you're trying to explain what you did to somebody, you want to be able to say, well, this recommendation is the recommendation because I included all this information, these factors and these inputs, and we measured our success this way, and that's why it's the recommendation. Just because it's a recommendation doesn't mean the decision maker is going to use it, and doesn't mean they're going to go with it. They may look at your evaluation criteria and say, you know what, I think this piece of your evaluation criteria is actually the most important thing, and that actually leads me to a different course of action, and therefore they choose that course of action. That's perfectly fine. You're still supporting the decision as best you can. So the next step is developing alternatives. So a lot of times we may be given alternatives, like the example of courses of action, but sometimes they're just very vague alternatives, and they need to be fleshed out a little bit, details added to them, or additional courses of action to be added to the pool. You need to think through these alternatives, the cause and effect of the alternatives, measure their strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats that they may open the system, the program, or whatever the situation is to. Again, we're just digging deeper, trying to understand it, thinking critically about our alternatives to make sure we've got an adequate number of alternatives to then measure against. Next, we're going to evaluate those alternatives. So now we've done the research, we've developed the solutions, the recommendations, the feasible alternatives, and we've done the cost analysis, we've done the budget analysis, we've done the risk or priority, we've gotten inputs from the stakeholders, we have all the data and the information that from the key people that we need, and now we can actually start scoring the solutions with our evaluation criteria that we established earlier. So you establish the evaluation criteria, you score yourself, and then you can say, okay, well, In this example, you see some of them are riskier than others. Some of them, the solution's a higher priority. The cost is different. And then ultimately the evaluation score is going to be different. So there's a lot of different ways to do evaluation scoring. And when you do best value competitions and source selections, that is decision support. They develop this criteria, the evaluation criteria, and they score the offerers' bids based on the information they provide. When we do courses of action, we can do that. When you do product support business case analysis, this is exactly what they do. They follow this rubric. They get weights for different priorities or different metrics or different attributes of the alternatives, and then they score those alternatives, and they come out with a total score for each alternative, and then they present those results to leadership. Lastly, we need to make a recommendation. So this can be the hardest part of the whole thing, because a lot of people here are capable of doing the analysis. The analysis part isn't necessarily the hard part. Getting the data, keeping the stakeholders involved, getting the feedback, understanding the weighting criteria, those are all very important things. But again, if you can't communicate what you did or how you came to the decision that you came to or why you're making a recommendation, then you're not going to get buy-in from the decision maker. And at the end of the day, this is your sales pitch of your alternative. You're saying this is the solution that I recommend, this is why I recommend it, and if you want the decision maker to agree with you. And if the decision maker doesn't agree with you, maybe you should have included the decision maker more in the whole process, because you should have been looking at that opinion, or that as a key stakeholder, the decision maker should have been factored into the analysis to begin with. And it can be a very iterative process. It doesn't, I know it shows it as just a short cycle, but you can go back and forth between phases. You could get to evaluation criteria and start digging deeper and realize that your problem statement is not worded correctly, and you need to go back and reevaluate your problem statement, or that you need to collect more data, or that you need to do something different. There's no, again, it's tailored, and it can be iterative, and you could even get to the solution and the decision maker says, well, that solution is garbage for this reason that you didn't even think about. And then you may have to go back and reevaluate, rescore, or rethink about how you did your evaluation and come back with a new recommendation or a revised recommendation. Is there any questions about the decision support model? So I think it's important, and I mean, everybody's got these slides, so it's important to have this as a reference, like when you're asked to do decision support, when you're supporting a decision, to just kind of reference the cycle, reference the fact that you're going to go through this 5-step process that you need to think through in order to do a critical analysis of the problem, in order to get a thorough understanding of the data, in order to get a good grip on how you measure success. Which can be very hard part of this, is measuring the goodness of your solution or your alternative. So